In a cluster of quiet English villages, 5,000 ordinary men did something no one had ever been asked to do before. One by one, they rolled up their sleeves and gave a sample of their blood farmers, bakers, school teachers, all to catch a single man among them who had killed two teenage girls. It was the first time in history that science claimed it could find a murderer this way, not from a witness, not from a confession, but by reading the invisible code written inside a person's own cells. There was just one problem. The man they were hunting had no intention of rolling up his sleeve, and the small, simple trick he used to avoid it very nearly worked. The two girls were both 15. The first was Linda Mann, who set out one evening in November of 1983 to walk through the Leicestershire village of Narborough, took a footpath the locals called the Black Pad, and never came home. She was found the next morning. She had been raped and murdered. For nearly 3 years, the case went cold. No suspect, no weapon. Nothing but a sample of the killer's semen and the blood type it revealed. And then it happened again. In the summer of 1986, in the neighboring village of Enderby, another 15-year-old Dawn Ashworth took a shortcut down a quiet lane and did not come back. She was found 2 days later killed the same way by what the evidence said was the same man. Whatever else this story becomes, and it becomes a landmark in every forensic textbook in the world, hold on to those two girls. Everything that follows sits on top of them. Between those two deaths lay almost 3 years in which a quiet corner of England lived under a shadow. A 15-year-old had been murdered on a footpath. People walked every day, and no one had been caught. Parents stopped letting their daughters out alone after dark. The fear settled in, and then the way fear does. When nothing happens, it slowly faded until the morning Dawn Ashworth was found, and the villagers understood that whoever had done the first was still among them, and had done it again. The police had a suspect, and on paper he looked like a good one. A local 17-year-old named Richard Buckland, a young man with learning difficulties who worked at a nearby psychiatric hospital and hung around the area where Dawn was found, seemed to know things about her death that an innocent person should not have known. Under long, intense questioning, he confessed to killing Dawn Ashworth. It is not hard to see how it can happen. A frightened, vulnerable teenager questioned for hours, eager to please or simply desperate for it to stop, can be led to say almost anything. And once the words are spoken, they are very hard to unsay. But there was a snag, and it was a strange one. Buckland confessed to the one murder and flatly, stubbornly denied the other. The police were certain the same man had committed both. They needed something to close that gap, to prove that Buckland was the killer of both girls. And so they reached for a tool that no police force on earth had ever used in a criminal case. A few miles away at the University of Leicester, a geneticist named Alec Jeffreys had stumbled almost by accident onto something extraordinary. On a September morning in 1984, while studying how traits pass through families, he pulled an X-ray film from a developing tank and saw in its smear of dark bands something he had not been looking for, a pattern that was different for every single person as individual, as a fingerprint, and impossible to fake. He called it DNA fingerprinting. By the time of the Leicestershire murders, it had been used to settle questions of paternity and immigration to prove who was related to whom. It had never once been pointed at a killer. The police brought Jeffries the evidence from both crime scenes and a sample of Richard Buckland's blood, fully expecting the new science to nail their man to both killings. What came back stopped everyone cold. The DNA confirmed that a single man had raped and murdered both girls, exactly as the police believed. But that man was not Richard Buckland. His DNA did not match either scene. Not one of them. Sit with what had just happened, because it is one of the quiet turning points in the history of justice. The very first time DNA was ever used in a criminal case, it was not used to convict a man. It was used to clear one. It took a frightened young man who had already confessed under pressure to a murder he did not commit, and it set him free. The first thing this technology ever proved was that a confession can be a lie, and that certainty, however total, can be wrong. Richard Buckland had spent more than 3 months locked up for a killing he had nothing to do with, on the strength of his own false words. He became the first person in the world ever cleared by DNA evidence, the opening case in what would grow over the decades that followed into thousands. But that left a problem the size of the sky. Buckland was innocent, and the real killer was still out there somewhere among the men of those villages, and now the police had his exact genetic signature, and not the faintest idea whose it was. A fingerprint is useless until you have a finger to match it to. So they did something that had never been done. They asked, in effect, the entire male population of the area to step forward. Around 5,000 men aged 17 to 34 were asked to give a little blood or saliva to be checked against the killer's profile. To save labor, the samples were first sorted by blood type, and only the fraction that matched the killers were carried on to the new DNA test. It was the world's first mass genetic screening. The newspapers called it blooding. A dragnet run, one man at a time, stretching across months. Giving a sample was, in theory, voluntary. In practice, a man who refused invited the very suspicion he would want to avoid. Thousands came forward, and the whole enormous effort produced nothing. Not a single match. Here is why. The killer had simply never given his own blood. A local baker named Colin Pitchfork married a father, an ordinary face in the village with nothing on his record, but some old convictions for indecent exposure had persuaded a workmate named Ian Kelly to take the test in his place. Kelly walked in carrying Pitchfork's papers and handed over his own clean blood under Pitchfork's name. It was an almost laughably simple cheat, and it had beaten the most advanced forensic tool on earth. 5,000 men had been screened, and the one man it was all for had quietly stepped out of the line, and it would have worked if not for the oldest weakness there is. Some months later, in a pub, the conversation turned, and Kelly let slip what he had done, explained within earshot of others how he had stood in for Colin Pitchfork. A woman nearby heard it, sat with it, and eventually went to the police. The first man in the world to try to outwit a DNA test was undone not by the science, but by loose talk in a bar. When they finally tested Pitchfork's real blood, it matched both the girls. He confessed. So step back and see what had changed in the world. For all of human history, a careful killer who left no witness behind was, in the deepest sense, safe. Memory faded leads dried up and time closed quietly over the truth. Now, for the first time, the trace a person left behind could speak, could point to them or clear them with a certainty no eyewitness had ever been able to offer. But notice the limit too, because it shapes everything that comes next. The only reason any of this worked is that in the end, they could lay hands on Colin Pitchfork's own blood and compare it. The science could confirm a guilty man once you already had him. It could not yet reach out and find an unknown one on its own. There was one obvious answer to that. If you cannot find an unknown sample, then build a library of known ones, start keeping people's genetic profiles on file so that next time the match might already be waiting. That was the seed of the DNA database. And it is exactly where our next story begins, at the edge of what even a database can do. Colin Pitchfork was sentenced to life in prison. Two families finally had their answer, and Richard Buckland walked free-handed his life back by the very same tool that took the real killers away. It was 1988, and the world had just learned something that would change crime forever. That a person can be named by a single drop of what they leave behind, and that the truth, even years late, could still be dragged into the light. For Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth, it came far too late. But it came, and the databases came. Country by country, the genetic profiles of convicted criminals were collected and stored so that a sample left at some future crime scene could be matched against the guilty in an afternoon. It was a revolution. But a database carries one quiet limitation. Built into its very nature, it can only recognize someone it already knows. It is in the end a list of people who have already been caught. So picture the nightmare waiting on the other side of that limit. A killer who has murdered for decades. The police have his DNA, his exact unmistakable profile, pulled from a dozen scenes. And when they run it against every offender on file, it comes back a stranger. He is not in the system. He has never been caught. And without a name, that perfect genetic fingerprint is just a number sitting in a folder. For 25 years, a man in South Los Angeles killed women and was never so much as questioned. The police had his DNA from a dozen crime scenes and no name to attach it to. He had been careful. He had been lucky. And the women he chose, poor black, often struggling, were the kind the city had quietly decided not to look very hard for. What finally undid him was not a slip of his own. It was his son, a young man who, one ordinary day, was arrested for something unrelated and gave a cheek swab like anyone would. And in a state lab, someone noticed that the son's DNA looked a great deal like a killer's. The killing began in 1985. Over the years that followed, young women in South Los Angeles started turning up dead shot or strangled their bodies left in alleys and behind dumpsters. Most of them were black. Many were poor or caught in the crack epidemic tearing through the neighborhood in those years, or selling sex to survive. The first was Deborah Jackson, 29. There would be at least 10 and very likely far more. And for a long, long time, the city barely seemed to notice. In those early years, there was no task force, no wave of headlines, no sense of a city gripped by fear, because the women who were dying were the kind a society quietly files under not a priority. Their mothers and sisters knew a killer was out there, and they said so loudly. A community organizer named Margaret Prescott helped form a coalition for the specific purpose of forcing the issue accusing the police of failing even to warn the neighborhood that a serial murderer was hunting in it. For years, officials played down the connection, and to the families, it often felt as though the message coming back was that these particular deaths simply did not rate the alarm. It was as if no one with the power to act was truly listening. There was one person who could have told them exactly what he looked like. In 1988, a woman named Inietra Washington accepted a ride from a mild-mannered man, and he shot her in the chest, assaulted her, took a photograph of her, and pushed her out of his car. She lived. She gave the police a description and helped with a sketch. But the case went cold anyway, and the man who had nearly killed her went back to his life, and after a long pause, back to killing. That pause, a gap of around 14 years in the murders, is what eventually earned him his nickname in the press, the Grim Sleeper. By the time the killings resumed and the city finally paid attention, investigators did connect the murders, and they did it with the tool from our first story, DNA. The same genetic profile turned up at scene after scene. They had the killer's exact signature, the very thing that had caught Colin Pitchfork. But they hit the wall the last story ended on. A profile only helps if it matches someone already on file, and this one matched no one. The man had been arrested before for other things, but those arrests came before the law required a sample. His DNA sat in the system for years, a flawless identification of a man with no name. What finally shook the case loose was the last killing. In 2007, a young woman named Janacia Peters was found, and her DNA tied her to the older murders, proof that the sleeper had woken. A police task force was assembled at last. A reporter dug into the buried pattern and gave the killer the name that put him on front pages. After 2 decades, the city was finally fully looking. But looking was not the same as finding. They still had a profile and no person to hang it on. For that, they would need an idea no one had successfully used before. Then in 2010, California tried something it had never pulled off before. Instead of searching the database for the killer, they searched it for a relative or anyone whose DNA was similar enough to hint at a blood tie. The idea is simple and a little uncanny. You may not have the man, but you might have his family. It was a new and controversial program. The state had only recently allowed investigators to comb the offender database for partial matches, the genetic near misses that can flag a possible parent, child, or sibling. Civil liberties advocates warned it could quietly turn every convicted person's relatives into suspects. They had actually run the search on this case once already, 2 years earlier, and it had turned up nothing. They tried again, and this time it worked, but only because of something that had happened in the meantime. A young man had been convicted of a weapons charge in 2009, and his DNA had gone into the database for the first time. When the new search ran, his profile came back far too close to the killer's to be coincidence. He was not the murderer. He was much too young born after some of the killings. He was the murderer's son. Stop and feel the strangeness of that. A serial killer who had eluded the police for 25 years, who had never once handed them his own sample, was given up by his own child, and only because that child happened to be arrested the year before for something that had nothing to do with any of it. If the son had never been picked up, the father might well have died a free man. The killer was undone by an accident. in someone else's life. The trail led to the young man's father, Lonnie Franklin Jr., a former city garbage collector and police garage worker who lived in the very heart of the neighborhood where the women had died. He had been there the whole time, a familiar face, a man who fixed cars in his yard, the last person his neighbors would ever have pointed to. To be certain that the police needed his DNA, and they needed it without spooking him. So an undercover officer trailed him to a birthday party at a pizzeria posed as a busboy and cleared his table quietly, carrying off a discarded slice of pizza, a fork, a napkin, a cup. The DNA on them matched the crime scenes exactly. In July of 2010, they arrested him. What makes the case sit so heavily is how ordinary he had managed to seem. There was no monster anyone could point to. In hindsight, no obvious darkness on the surface. He offered some of his victims a ride or money or drugs. He killed them, and then he went back to being the neighbor who tinkered with engines. When police searched his home, they found something that turned the stomach of the whole investigation: hundreds of photographs and videos of women many never identified. They released the images to the public, asking a simple, awful question. Who are these women, and are any of them still alive? The case rested on the DNA, and the DNA was not ambiguous. It took years to bring him to trial. He was not convicted until 2016 and sentenced to death more than 3 decades after the first killing. Some of the mothers who had marched and shouted in the 1980s did not live long enough to see it, and the woman he had shot and left for dead back in 1988, Enietra Washington, lived to walk into that courtroom and testify against him, the one who got away, helping to make sure he never would. He was convicted of 10 murders, and investigators believe the real total may be more than twice that. So look at how far the reach of this science had grown in a single generation. With Colin Pitchfork, they needed the killer's own blood handed over and matched. Here they needed nothing from the killer at all. A relative's DNA was enough. Your own family can now give you away without ever meaning to, without even knowing that they have. But there is a second half to this story that I don't want to slide past, because it is the part that should stay with you. This man was able to kill for 25 years, in large part because of who his victims were. A system that should have hunted him from the very first body instead looked away over and over because the dead were poor and black and easy to overlook. The women's own families had been screaming into that silence for decades. In the end, the DNA did more than catch a killer. It forced a city that had refused to count these women to finally say their names out loud in a courtroom as the victims of a single man it should have stopped a quarter of a century earlier. So say them: Deborah Jackson, Henrietta Wright, Barbara Ware, Bernita Sparks, Mary Lowe, Lockrika Jefferson, Alicia Alexander, Princess Bertha Muir, who was 15, Valerie McCorvey, Janisha Peters, 25, the last of the ones we know, and the women in those photographs whose names were never added to any list. They were not a priority. They were daughters and mothers and sisters, and the only reason the man who killed them was ever named is a fact as ordinary and as unchosen as a bloodline, that somewhere across the city his son had walked into a station and opened his mouth for a swab. The familial search was a leap. Suddenly, you no longer needed the killer himself, only a relative the police had already caught. But notice how narrow that opening still is. It works only if one of the killer's relatives happens to be a convicted criminal with their DNA sitting in a law enforcement database. So, what about the killer whose family is clean? No brother in prison, no son with a record, no one on any police file at all. For a man like that, even the familial search reaches its wall and stops. Which brings us to the last story and to the moment someone asked a question that changed everything. What if you didn't search the police databases at all? What if you searched the ones that millions of ordinary people had cheerfully signed themselves up for? In a tidy suburb near Sacramento, an elderly man spent his days puttering in his yard and shouting at neighbors who mowed their lawns too early. He had been a police officer once. To the people on his street, he was odd, reclusive, and harmless, a grumpy old man, nothing more. He was also, the evidence would say, the most prolific serial rapist and killer the state of California had ever known. A man who terrorized it through the 1970s and 80s and then simply dissolved into an ordinary life for 30 years. No witness ever caught him. No confession ever caught him. In the end, he was caught by relatives. He had never met people who had done nothing more sinister than spit into a tube out of curiosity about where their family came from. For more than a decade, beginning in the mid-1970s, a single man held huge stretches of California hostage, though for most of that time, no one understood. It was a single man. He began as a burglar, slipping through dark houses while families slept. Then he became a rapist, breaking into the bedrooms of couples, binding the man and assaulting the woman while the household lay helpless a few feet away. He was methodical to the point of ritual. At some scenes, he balanced dishes on the bound husband's back and warned that if he heard them fall, he would kill everyone in the house. And then he escalated, as such men do, into a murderer. He terrorized whole communities. People bought guns and dogs. Couples lay awake listening. An entire region learned to be afraid of its own bedroom windows. And because he struck in so many places, he was hunted as several different criminals at once under several different names. In one county, he was the Visalia ransacker. Around Sacramento, the East Area rapist. Across Southern California, the original Night Stalker. For years, the detectives chasing each of those names had no idea they were all hunting the same man. By the time the attacks stopped around 1986, he had committed at least 13 murders and close to 50 rapes, and then he was simply gone. For 30 years, nothing. No arrest, no slip, no deathbed confession. There was a reason he was so impossible to catch, and it is chilling in hindsight. He had himself been a police officer. He served on 2 small California police forces in the 1970s, during the very years the attacks were unfolding nearby, until he was quietly fired after being caught shoplifting a hammer and a can of dog repellent. A petty theft ended his career in uniform, even as he was in secret among the most dangerous men in the state. He knew how investigations worked, what evidence mattered, how to leave a scene clean. He had, in effect, studied the very people who would spend their careers hunting him. He might have died unknown if not for the people who refused to let the case rest. One of them was a writer named Michelle McNamara, who became so consumed by the unsolved attacks that she gave the still nameless man the title that finally united all his crimes, the Golden State Killer, and pulled the scattered cases back into public view. The book she was writing took its name from something the killer himself had once whispered to a victim, a promise that he would be gone in the dark. She did not live to see the end of it. She died in 2016, 2 years before his arrest, and her book was published after her death, helping draw a national audience back to a case the world had nearly forgotten. Others kept going too. A cold case investigator named Paul Holes spent the better part of his career circling this one man, and by 2001, the science from our earlier stories had at least proven something crucial. DNA testing established that the Northern California rapist and the Southern California killer were one and the same. Investigators finally knew they were chasing a single monster, and they had his complete genetic profile. What they did not have, what they had never had, was a name to put on it. Just like the Grim Sleeper, his DNA matched no one in any database. The trail, for all its certainty, simply stopped. By 2018, Holes and a small team decided to try something that reached far beyond any police database, an idea that would change criminal justice as profoundly as Alec Jeffrey's discovery had decades before. They took the killer's DNA profile and uploaded it to a public genealogy website called GED Match, the ordinary kind of site where people send off a sample to find long-lost cousins and fill in their family trees. The killer himself had never used such a site. But some of his relatives had distant ones, people who had simply spat into a tube out of curiosity. The search came back with a scattering of them third and fourth cousins, strangers who shared a sliver of the killer's DNA. It was not a name. It was a starting point. And then the painstaking work began. Working with a genetic genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter, the team spent weeks taking those faint, distant matches and building the family trees outward and downward, tracing branches across generations of marriages and births and deaths, slowly reconstructing the enormous web of people descended from the same ancestors as the killer. From a tree of thousands, they narrowed and narrowed the right branch of the family, the right region, the right age, a man who had been in the right places at the right times. The whole vast structure finally tapered to a single point one living man. Stop here because this is the heart of it. This was a person who had spent a career learning how to leave no trace. He had eluded an entire state for 40 years through sheer discipline, careful, methodical, a trained investigator who knew precisely what not to leave behind. And in the end, none of that caution counted for anything. Because the thing that gave him up was not something he did or failed to do. It was his own family cousins he had never met, who had never heard his name, who had uploaded their DNA for a hobby and with no idea they were doing it, drawn a map that led straight to his front door. You can scrub a crime scene of everything you touched. You cannot scrub it of your own blood relatives. The tree pointed to Joseph James D'Angelo, a 72-year-old former police officer, living quietly outside Sacramento. To be certain, investigators did exactly what had confirmed the grim sleeper. They followed him and collected DNA he threw away from a car door, from a tissue in his trash. It matched the crime scenes. In April of 2018, they arrested him in the same corner of California where he had attacked one of his earliest victims more than 40 years before. Alone in an interrogation room afterward, he was heard murmuring to himself as though some other man had done it all. The scale of what he eventually admitted is hard to hold in the mind. 13 murders, around 50 rapes, more than 120 burglaries, scores of crimes so old the law could no longer reach them. He pleaded guilty to all of it and was sentenced to die in prison with no possibility of release. There is no real doubt about his guilt. He confessed to it himself. But this case opened a question we are still arguing over, and I don't want to wave it away. The genealogy sites those distant cousins used were never built for the police. The people who uploaded their DNA were searching for a family, not consenting to a manhunt. And what this case proved is that your genetic privacy is no longer entirely your own. A relative you have never met can expose you, and you can expose them just by spitting into a tube. The very power that dragged the Golden State Killer out of 40 years of darkness is a power that now reaches at least a little toward all of us. That is the bargain this technology quietly asks, and it is worth being honest that the bargain is real. In the wake of this case, the site the investigators had used changed its rules so that people now have to choose in advance whether to let the police search their DNA at all. Courts and lawmakers are still drawing the lines. The technology, as it so often does, arrived faster than the rules to govern it. But step back and look at the whole arc these three stories have drawn. To catch Colin Pitchfork, they needed the killer's own blood handed over and matched. To catch the Grim Sleeper, they needed less only a relative who happened to sit in a police file. And to catch the Golden State Killer, they needed less still. Not the man, not a close relative in any criminal database, but simply the existence somewhere out in the ordinary world of distant cousins who shared a fraction of his DNA. With each step, the net was thrown wider until it stretched over nearly everyone. That is the moment the cold case stopped being a safe place to hide. Time used to be a killer's greatest ally. It buried witnesses, eroded evidence, and outlasted the patience of investigators. A man who could simply wait and stay quiet and disappear into an ordinary life was a man who could win. The family tree is what took that away from him. The most dangerous thing to a murderer today is no longer a witness who might remember his face. It is a cousin he will never meet. When DeAngelo was finally sentenced, the people he had spent decades haunting filled a room, and for days one after another told him to his face what he had done to their lives. Survivors who had carried it silently for 40 years, husbands and children of the women he had killed, people who had grown old inside the fear he created. Many of them had assumed they would go to their own graves without ever knowing his name, and now they stood a few feet from him and finally said theirs. And here is what sets this story apart from the others we have told. The method that found him did not stop with him. Within months of his arrest, the same technique was already naming other long-hidden killers, and even giving names back to victims who had lain unidentified for decades. In the years since that patient work crime scene DNA public family trees branches traced toward a name has broken open hundreds of cases everyone had given up on. Killings from the 1960s and 70s. Bodies that had no names. Names that had no bodies. For a great many people who had long ago made their uneasy peace with never knowing, the science has quietly done something it could never do before. It has turned never into not yet. Johnson here, quick pause before the last one, because it's the case that took everything we've just seen and pushed it about as far as it can go. If you're finding these as fascinating as I do, Subscribing and dropping a comment genuinely helps the channel keep going and tells me which cases to chase next. All right, the big one. 3 killers across 40 years and 2 continents. A baker in an English village. A man in the alleys of South Los Angeles. A former police officer in a quiet California suburb. Each of them believed with good reason that he had won, that he had outlasted the witnesses, the detectives, the technology of his time, and slipped safely into the past. And each of them was wrong for the same reason. Look at the arc one more time. To catch the first, they needed his own blood. To catch the second, they needed a relative already sitting in a police file. To catch the third, they needed nothing but the existence somewhere out in the world of distant cousins who had never even met him. With every step, the reach of the science grew until it stretched over almost everyone alive. That is what these stories are really about. For all of human history, time was on the killer's side. Stay quiet long enough, and the case would go cold. The witnesses would die, and the truth would be buried with them. DNA reversed it. The one thing a person can never change, never hide, and never outrun is the code written in their own cells and the family that shares it. You can vanish from everyone who ever saw your face. You cannot vanish from your own blood. And there is one last thing, the part that makes this story different from the darker ones we've told. The same science that named these 3 men is right now naming others and giving names back to the unidentified, dead-cracking open cases that sat untouched for half a century. For thousands of families who had long since given up, the answer is no longer never. It is not yet. I'm Johnson. Thank you for sitting with this one. I'll see you on the next.